Judge demanded she remove her medals until General stormed in and silenced everyone. Margaret Rowland faced humiliation at Ellington Air Base until a faded patch revealed her classified heroic past. Like, if you believe heroes deserve recognition, subscribe for more inspiring stories, and comment where you're watching from. The gavel slammed against polished wood with the finality of a coffin lid. The sound echoed through the internal courtroom at Ellington Air Base, bouncing off dark mahogany walls and settling into the uncomfortable silence that followed. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across aligned tables, creating a sterile atmosphere that felt more like an execution chamber than a place of justice. Colonel Judge Harland Pierce stood behind the bench, his steel-gray uniform pressed to military perfection. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had seen too many fraudulent claims cross his desk, too many civilians trying to claim honors they'd never earned. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and stared down at the small woman standing before him. Margaret Maggie Rowland kept her hands buried deep in the pockets of her maintenance jacket, her fingers automatically finding the familiar grooves of metal tools and the persistent stains of aircraft grease that never quite washed clean. Her breathing remained controlled, measured, a habit she'd never quite shaken from another life, another version of herself that most people here would never believe existed. "Mrs. Rowland," Pierce began, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "2 medals of distinction on the same service record. That's fraud, isn't it?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Maggie felt every eye in the room boring into her. From the panel of stern-faced officers seated at the long table to the handful of base personnel who'd gathered to witness what promised to be another routine disciplinary hearing, she could hear the whispered conversations, the barely contained chuckles, the sound of someone shifting in their seat with obvious discomfort at watching another civilian get their comeuppance. Without ceremony, Maggie pulled her hands from her pockets and began to shrug off her maintenance jacket. The movement was deliberate, almost defiant, as if she were removing armor piece by piece as she pulled the coat away from her shoulders. Something small and fabric fluttered to the floor, a patch, faded and worn, that had been loosely sewn to the inner lining. The camera-like attention of everyone present followed its descent, watching as it landed silently on the polished floor tiles. The patch was barely recognizable, its colors bleached by time and wear, but the lettering was still partially visible. Fragments of numbers, a wing designation, words that seemed to shimmer just beyond recognition. "Duplication error," someone whispered from the gallery. A captain leaned over to his colleague, pointing at the fallen patch. "Probably sewed that on herself." Low laughter rippled through the small crowd. Pierce's expression hardened further, if such a thing were possible. "Remove your medals," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "All of them. You cannot display honors you cannot substantiate." The humiliation was public, deliberate, designed to strip away whatever dignity Maggie might have thought she possessed. Around the room, faces turned toward her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment, as if watching a movie they'd seen before. Another civilian trying to claim military glory they'd never earned. But Maggie didn't move toward the pins on her jacket. Instead, she bent down slowly, deliberately, and picked up the fallen patch. Her fingers closed around the faded fabric, and for just a moment, her controlled expression flickered. Something passed across her features. Not shame, but something deeper, more complex. Memory, perhaps. Recognition. She straightened, the patch clutched in her fist, and met Pierce's gaze directly. "I won't remove anything I earned," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. There was something in her tone, in the way she held herself, that didn't quite match the image of a frightened civilian caught in a lie. Pierce's eyes narrowed. The hearing was supposed to be routine, another case of someone trying to claim unearned recognition, someone who could be easily intimidated into admitting their fraud. But this woman's composure was beginning to irritate him. "The documentation doesn't support your claim," he said, gesturing toward a computer screen that displayed her service records. "These medals appear twice in the system. That's an administrative impossibility, unless someone attempted to duplicate their awards." Maggie's hand tightened around the patch, but her expression remained steady. In the gallery, a middle-aged administrative clerk named Elliot Crane found himself leaning forward, studying the woman more carefully. Something about her bearing, about the way she'd picked up that patch, struck him as oddly familiar. The maintenance hangar smelled of aircraft fuel, hot metal, and the peculiar mixture of grease and determination that seemed to permeate every surface. Golden morning light streamed through high windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor where Maggie knelt beside a dismantled engine assembly. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each turn of the wrench calculated and sure. The torque specifications had to be exact. Too loose, and the engine would fail in flight. Too tight, and the metal would stress and crack under pressure. She understood these margins intimately, the narrow space between safety and catastrophe that defined so much of military life. Need any help? Maggie, a young technician called from across the hangar. Tommy Rodriguez had been working civilian maintenance for 2 years, but he still approached the older engines with nervous respect. Maggie glanced up, a brief smile crossing her grease-stained features. "I've worked swing shift before," she replied, her voice carrying just a hint of something that might have been amusement. "This is nothing." The comment was casual, throwaway, but it contained layers that Tommy couldn't quite parse. Swing shift implied experience, long hours, the kind of work that demanded both physical endurance and mental sharpness. Most of the civilian contractors had backgrounds in automotive repair or basic mechanical work. Maggie's precision suggested something more comprehensive. A klaxon sounded across the base, routine aircraft movement, and Maggie's posture changed instantly. Her back straightened, her head turned toward the nearest exit. Her eyes swept the hangar in a pattern that seemed to catalog every person, every potential route of egress. The reaction lasted perhaps 3 seconds before she caught herself, forcing her shoulders to relax. But the movement had been automatic, instinctive, military. She returned to her work, reaching into her tool bag for a different wrench. As she rummaged through the collection of instruments, her fingers brushed against something that wasn't a tool, a small, metallic disc tucked into a side pocket. A challenge coin, she realized, though she didn't remove it to examine it closely. Just touching its familiar weight was enough. The coin was warm against her fingertips. Worn smooth from handling, she let her thumb trace its edges for just a moment before continuing her search for the proper wrench. "You know," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, "people aren't always what they seem." The comment drifted across the hangar like dust motes in the afternoon light. Tommy looked over, curious, but Maggie had already returned to her engine, her focus apparently complete. Yet there was something about the way she held herself, the way her movements carried a precision that went beyond mere mechanical competence, that suggested depths he couldn't fathom. Across the hangar, near the administrative office that overlooked the work floor, Elliot Crane stood with a clipboard, ostensibly checking inventory, but his attention kept drifting to the woman working alone by the engine assembly. During the hearing, when she'd picked up that fallen patch, something had struck him as significant. The way she'd moved, the way she'd spoken. It didn't match the profile of someone trying to fraudulently claim military honors. He made a mental note to look more carefully at that patch later. Something about the partial lettering had seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place why. Maggie finished her torque specifications and sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on a rag that had seen better days. The engine was properly assembled now, ready for installation and testing, but as she packed her tools, she found her hand drifting back to that coin in her pocket. She didn't know why she still carried it. Sentiment, maybe, or perhaps it was just habit, the kind of ritual that becomes so ingrained you don't even notice it anymore. Whatever the reason, touching the familiar metal always brought back sensations she preferred to keep buried. The taste of recycled air, the vibration of aircraft engines, the particular quality of light that filtered through reinforced windows at 30,000 feet. Memories that belonged to someone else. Someone she'd been a long time ago. The internal courtroom felt smaller the second time, the walls pressing closer as if the building itself were conspiring to increase the pressure. Colonel Pierce had called the proceeding back to order with the same theatrical authority, but now there was an edge to his performance. Irritation at having to deal with what should have been a simple case. Maggie stood in the same position as before, but this time Elliot Crane was closer, positioned near the administrative table where he could observe more carefully. The patch she'd retrieved lay on the evidence table now, officially entered into the record as Exhibit A, though Pierce seemed to regard it with the same disdain he might show a child's crude forgery. "Mrs. Rowland," Pierce began, his tone suggesting barely contained exasperation. "I'm prepared to offer you a simple resolution to this matter. Admit that the medals were obtained in error, a clerical mistake, perhaps, and I'll recommend that the charges be archived without prejudice to your employment status." The offer hung in the air like a trap. Around the room, several officers nodded approvingly. It was reasonable, generous even, a way for everyone to save face while disposing of an uncomfortable situation. Maggie's hand moved unconsciously to her jacket pocket, her fingers finding the challenge coin through the fabric. The metal was warm against her palm, and she could feel the raised edges of whatever insignia was carved into its surface. She didn't need to look at it to know what it represented. The weight of it in her hand was enough. "I won't admit to fraud," she said clearly, "because I didn't commit fraud." The words were simple, but they landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of conversation began immediately. Whispers, murmured consultations, the soft sound of papers being shuffled as people tried to determine what they were actually witnessing. Pierce's jaw tightened. "The documentation doesn't support your claim. Our records show duplicate entries for the same commendation. That's not an accident, Mrs. Rowland. That's intentional deception." He gestured toward a large monitor that displayed her service records. Highlighting the anomalous entries in red, the presentation was professional, conclusive, designed to demonstrate beyond doubt that something irregular had occurred. But Elliot Crane found himself studying the faded patch on the evidence table instead of the digital records. During the break between sessions, he'd managed to examine it more closely, and what he'd seen had disturbed him. The lettering, though partially obscured, included fragments that looked like 4/19th, and what might have been wing. More troubling was a designation that seemed to read ghost range, terminology that tickled the edges of his memory in uncomfortable ways. "She could just take the deal," someone whispered behind him. "Walk away clean." Pierce seemed to hear the comment and nodded slightly. "The offer remains open, Mrs. Rowland. This is your opportunity to resolve this matter with dignity." But Maggie's expression hadn't changed. If anything, her posture had become more erect, more formal. "My dignity isn't negotiable," she replied. The response clearly frustrated Pierce, who had expected either quick capitulation or obvious guilt. This steady resistance from someone who should have been intimidated was beginning to undermine the narrative he'd constructed about the case. From his position near the administrative table, Elliot made a decision that would change everything. Quietly, without drawing attention to himself, he slipped the faded patch from the evidence table into his jacket pocket. Whatever was printed on that fabric, whatever those partial designations meant, he intended to find out. The hearing continued for another 20 minutes, but Elliot barely heard the proceedings. His mind was already racing ahead, planning how to access the records he would need, wondering what he might find buried in the military's vast administrative databases. When the session finally adjourned, Maggie walked past him toward the exit. For just a moment, their eyes met, and he saw something there that convinced him he was making the right choice. She wasn't a fraud, whatever was happening here, whatever the story behind those medals and that mysterious patch. Margaret Rowland was exactly who she claimed to be. The base archives occupied a windowless room in the basement of the administrative building, filled with filing cabinets that dated back decades and computer terminals that hummed with the accumulated weight of military bureaucracy. Elliot Crane had spent most of his adult life navigating these systems, understanding the peculiar logic of military record-keeping and the labyrinthine ways that information could be classified, reclassified, or simply lost in the vast machinery of institutional memory. He sat alone at his terminal, the faded patch spread carefully on the desk beside his keyboard. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the lettering was more visible than it had been in the courtroom. He could make out 419th Recon Wing with reasonable certainty, and below that, in letters that seemed to have been added later, Ghost Range. His fingers trembled slightly as he began typing search queries into the database. The 419th Reconnaissance Wing was easy enough to find. It had been a legitimate unit, operational during the late 1990s and early 2000s, primarily involved in weather reconnaissance and atmospheric research, but the more specific designation, Ghost Range, returned only error messages and access denials. "Classified," he whispered to himself, "or expunged." He tried different approaches, searching for operational names that might be related, for personnel records that might contain similar designations. Each query led to dead ends or security protocols that were clearly above his clearance level. Frustrated, he leaned back in his chair and studied the patch again. There was something else, something he'd missed during his initial examination. Along the inner edge, barely visible unless you knew where to look, someone had sewn a small cloth tag. He carefully peeled it back, revealing additional markings. Op 7G, eyes Frostline. Frostline, he repeated, and this time his voice caught. He'd heard that name before, though he couldn't immediately place where. Something from years ago, maybe something he'd overheard in conversations between senior personnel. He tried the new search terms. Operation Frostline returned a single result, a notice that the files were sealed under executive order classification, available only to personnel with specific need-to-know authorization. Elliot sat staring at the screen, his mind racing. Whatever Margaret Rowland had been involved in, it wasn't a simple case of fraudulent metals. This was something real, something significant enough to warrant ongoing classification years after the fact. He picked up his phone and dialed the extension for Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the base's senior records officer. If anyone would know how to access sealed files, it would be her. Mitchell here. Sarah. It's Elliot Crane from Archives. I need a consultation on a classified record access Operation Frostline. Designation Op 7G. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Where did you hear that name? It's related to a disciplinary hearing. Civilian contractor with questionable service records. Hold on. He could hear papers rustling, keyboard clicks, then a sharp intake of breath. Elliot, you need to stop what you're doing right now and bring me everything you have. This isn't a matter for standard archives. What do you mean? I mean Operation Frostline requires command authority clearance to access, the kind of clearance that comes from people with stars on their shoulders. Elliot looked down at the patch, suddenly understanding that he'd stumbled into something far more significant than a routine fraud investigation. Whatever Margaret Rowland had done, whatever operation she'd been part of, it was important enough that the military had buried it under layers of classification that had remained in place for years. Outside his office window, he could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines warming up for evening flights. Somewhere on the base, Margaret Rowland was probably finishing her shift, cleaning grease from her hands, preparing to go home to whatever quiet life she'd built for herself after leaving the service. But if what he suspected was true, if the evidence in front of him meant what he thought it meant, then that quiet life was about to become much more complicated. He carefully folded the patch and placed it in his jacket pocket. Whatever happened next, whatever doors his discovery might open, Margaret Rowland deserved to have the truth told about who she really was. The corridor outside the archives felt different as Elliot walked toward Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's office, as if the walls themselves were aware that something significant was unfolding. His footsteps echoed against polished linoleum, and he found himself checking over his shoulder, though he couldn't say exactly what he was looking for. Mitchell's office was located in the secure wing of the administrative building, behind doors that required key card access, and where conversations were automatically assumed to be sensitive. When Elliot knocked, her voice was sharp and immediate. Come. She was a woman in her mid-40s with graying hair and the kind of posture that suggested decades of carrying responsibilities that most people never imagined. Her desk was meticulously organized, everything in its precise place, but when Elliot entered, she was holding a telephone receiver and her expression was troubled. Yes, sir, she was saying into the phone. I understand the sensitivity, authorization for Op 7G access. Yes, sir, I'll wait for your call. She hung up and studied Elliot with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Show me what you found. Elliot placed the patch on her desk, careful not to disturb the neat arrangement of documents and file folders. Under the office's bright lighting, the faded designations were clearly visible. 419th Recon Wing, Ghost Range, and the inner tag with its cryptic Op 7G Frostline marking. Mitchell bent over the patch without touching it, as if it might explode at contact. Jesus, she whispered. Where did this come from? Margaret Rowland, the civilian contractor who's been charged with fraudulent metal claims. She dropped it during her hearing, and you took it. I thought there might be more to the story than Judge Pierce was considering. Mitchell looked at him for a long moment, then picked up her phone again. "I need to make another call. This goes higher than base command." While she dialed, Elliot found himself thinking about Margaret Rowland. During the hearing, she'd seemed so ordinary, so easy to dismiss. A maintenance worker with grease-stained hands and thick glasses. Exactly the kind of person who might try to claim unearned military honors. But her composure under pressure, the way she'd refused Pierce's offer of an easy resolution, suggested something more complex. "Colonel Waverly's office," Mitchell was saying into the phone. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell at Ellington. I need to speak with the general about a classification matter. Operation Frostline." Even speaking through a phone line, the name seemed to carry weight. Mitchell's expression grew more serious as she listened to whoever was on the other end. "Yes, sir, I'll wait for his authorization." She hung up and turned back to Elliot. "General Waverly is flying in personally. Whatever this operation was, whatever Mrs. Rowland's connection to it might be, it's important enough to bring the commander of Special Operations to Texas." Outside the office, Elliot could hear the normal sounds of a military base winding down for the evening. Vehicles starting up, people walking past in the corridors, the distant sound of aircraft operations. But inside this room, surrounded by classified documents and sealed files, everything felt suspended, as if they were waiting for something momentous to begin. Margaret Rowland had finished her shift hours ago. She was probably at home now, unaware that her past was about to catch up with her in ways she'd never imagined. The quiet life she'd built, the anonymity she'd maintained, was about to be stripped away by a faded patch and a series of telephone calls that were climbing the military hierarchy like emergency flares. "Should I contact Judge Pierce?" Elliot asked. Mitchell shook her head. "Pierce doesn't have clearance for this. When General Waverly arrives, this becomes his jurisdiction." The implications of that statement settled over the room like dust. Whatever Margaret Rowland had done, whatever Operation Frostline had been, it was significant enough to supersede normal military justice procedures. And somewhere on the base, in a maintenance hangar that smelled of aircraft fuel and determination, a woman who thought her past was safely buried was about to discover that some secrets were too important to stay hidden forever. The courtroom had been hastily reconfigured, transformed from a routine administrative hearing space into something that resembled a formal military tribunal. Additional chairs had been brought in. Security personnel stood at strategic positions, and an American flag had been positioned prominently behind the judge's bench. General Isaac Waverly's arrival had been announced by the unmistakable sound of a military helicopter touching down on the base's landing pad, followed by the kind of coordinated activity that only occurred when someone with significant authority was moving through a secure facility. Margaret Rowland sat in the same chair she'd occupied during previous sessions. But everything else had changed. The casual observers were gone, replaced by stern-faced officers whose presence suggested that this was no longer a simple disciplinary matter. Colonel Pierce looked uncomfortable, constantly adjusting his uniform and glancing toward the door as if expecting interruption at any moment. Elliot Crane had been positioned at a table near the front of the room, the recovered patch displayed prominently on a clean white cloth. The faded fabric seemed almost insignificant, given the elaborate preparations surrounding it. But he knew that small pieces of evidence often carry disproportionate weight in military proceedings. When the door opened, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. General Waverly was a man who commanded attention without effort. His green dress uniform was immaculate, his posture erect despite what must have been considerable travel fatigue. And his eyes carried the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He was accompanied by 2 aides, but it was clear that he was operating under his own authority. "At ease," he said quietly. Though most people in the room had already frozen into positions of attention, he walked directly to the evidence table, his gaze fixed on the faded patch. When he saw it, his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that everyone present understood they were witnessing something significant. 419 Recon Wing, he said softly, as if speaking to himself. Ghost range. Then he looked up, his eyes scanning the room until they found Margaret Rowland. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but Elliot could see that her breathing had changed, becoming more controlled, more deliberate. "Nobody touches those medals," Waverly said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom with absolute authority. The words landed like a physical blow. Colonel Pierce, who had been preparing to resume the hearing, seemed to deflate slightly. Several officers straightened in their chairs, suddenly aware that they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. Waverly reached into his jacket and withdrew a small wooden box. He opened it carefully, revealing a medal that bore striking similarities to the ones Margaret Rowland wore on her civilian maintenance jacket. The medal gleamed under the courtroom lights, and etched into its surface was a design that matched the faded patch. Ghost Range. Operation Frostline, he announced, his voice filling the room. Classified weather reconnaissance and emergency extraction. Mrs. Rowland was the lead navigator for Echo Lima Recovery Team. He paused, allowing the information to settle before continuing. Her name was sealed under executive classification for operational security. For 15 years, her service record has been compartmentalized to protect ongoing intelligence operations. Margaret Rowland remained motionless, but tears had begun to form in her eyes. Not tears of relief. Exactly, but something deeper. The complex emotion of someone who had carried a burden alone for longer than anyone should have to. The medals are legitimate, Waverly continued, and they represent actions that saved the lives of an entire aircrew during extreme weather conditions in the Arctic Circle. Colonel Pierce seemed to struggle for words. Sir, the documentation was deliberately obscured. Waverly cut him off. Standard protocol for classified operations. Mrs. Rowland has been living under administrative cover for her own protection and the protection of her former unit members. The room erupted in whispers, but they were quickly silenced as Waverly approached Margaret Rowland. She stood as he drew near, her posture automatically shifting into military bearing despite her civilian clothes. Sergeant First Class Margaret Rowland, he said formally. Your service to your country has never been forgotten. And then, in front of everyone, he pinned the medal from his wooden box onto her maintenance jacket, positioning it carefully beside the others she already wore. The sound of metal against fabric seemed unnaturally loud in the silent courtroom. When he stepped back, Margaret Rowland was no longer a maintenance worker accused of fraud. She was a decorated veteran whose sacrifice had finally been acknowledged. The aftermath of General Waverly's revelation transformed the courtroom into something resembling a minor diplomatic incident. Officers who had been prepared to witness a routine fraud conviction found themselves scrambling to understand new information that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the proceedings. Colonel Pierce attempted to maintain some semblance of judicial authority, but his efforts were increasingly futile. The documentation he'd relied upon, the digital records that had seemed so conclusive, were now revealed as incomplete fragments of a deliberately obscured story. I need to see the complete files, he insisted, but General Waverly's response was immediate and final. The files remain classified. What I've told you is sufficient for these proceedings. Pierce's frustration was visible, but he was operating well outside his area of authority now. The case had moved beyond military justice into the realm of intelligence operations, where different rules applied and where his judicial prerogatives carried little weight. Margaret Rowland stood quietly throughout the bureaucratic confusion, her hand unconsciously touching the newly pinned medal. The metal was warm against her jacket, and the weight of it felt both familiar and strange, like returning to a language she'd once spoken fluently but hadn't used in years. Elliot Crane watched from his position near the evidence table, fascinated by the rapid transformation taking place around them. An hour ago, Margaret Rowland had been a suspected fraud facing administrative punishment. Now she was a decorated veteran whose service record was apparently significant enough to warrant personal intervention from one of the military's most senior commanders. Mrs. Rowland, General Waverly said, his tone shifting from formal authority to something more personal. Would you be willing to speak with me privately? She nodded without hesitation, and together they left the courtroom for a smaller conference room adjacent to the main hearing space. The door closed behind them, leaving everyone else to process what they'd just witnessed. This is unprecedented, Pierce muttered, but his complaint carried little conviction. He was clearly out of his depth, dealing with classification levels and operational authorities that extended far beyond his experience. In the smaller room, General Waverly gestured for Margaret to sit across from him at a simple metal table. For the first time since his arrival, his military bearing relaxed slightly, revealing glimpses of genuine fatigue and what might have been relief. 15 years, he said quietly. 15 years of carrying that alone. Margaret's composure, which had remained steady throughout the hearing, finally began to crack. "I thought no one would ever know," she whispered. "I thought it was just buried forever." "Operation Frostline saved 4 lives," Waverly replied. "Your navigation kept Echo Lima in the air during the worst weather conditions our meteorology teams had ever recorded. Without your coordinates, that aircraft would have been lost over the Arctic." The memories were complex, layered with sensations that she'd spent years trying to forget. The vibration of aircraft engines straining against impossible wind conditions, the taste of recycled air in a cramped cockpit, the particular quality of light that filtered through ice-covered windows during a storm that shouldn't have been survivable. "The classification was necessary," Waverly continued. "The technology you were carrying, the intelligence you'd gathered, it all had to remain secret, but we never forgot what you did." Margaret touched the challenge coin in her pocket, the one she'd carried all these years without really understanding why. Now its presence felt different, less like a relic from a past life and more like a promise that had finally been kept. "What happens now?" she asked. Waverly smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen from him. "Now you get to decide who you want to be. The secrecy requirements have been lifted. Your service record can be restored to its proper place." Through the conference room window, they could see the courtroom where Colonel Pierce was attempting to salvage some authority over proceedings that had moved entirely beyond his control, but that bureaucratic struggle seemed distant now, irrelevant compared to the personal reckoning taking place in this smaller, quieter space. "I've spent so long being nobody," Margaret said. "I'm not sure I remember how to be somebody again." "You never stopped being somebody," Waverly replied. "You just stopped letting other people see it." The base's main conference room had been converted into an impromptu ceremony space, with chairs arranged in neat rows facing a simple podium. Word of the afternoon's events had spread through Ellington Air Base with the peculiar efficiency of military gossip, and personnel who had no direct connection to the original hearing found themselves drawn to witness whatever was about to unfold. Margaret Rowland sat in the front row, still wearing her maintenance jacket, but somehow carrying herself differently now. The weight of the newly restored metals seemed to have altered her posture, reminding her of movements and bearing that had been buried under years of deliberate anonymity. General Waverly had made several phone calls during the break, speaking with personnel whose names and titles suggested connections to operations that remained classified. But the fragments that had been overheard, references to Echo Lima survivors and Frostline personnel, had created enough curiosity to fill the conference room with interested observers. When Waverly took the podium, the room fell silent with military precision. 15 years ago, he began, a weather reconnaissance mission encountered conditions that exceeded all operational parameters: Arctic storm systems, wind speeds that should have torn apart any aircraft attempting to operate in them, and intelligence requirements that demanded completion despite impossible circumstances. His voice carried the weight of someone who had personally lived through the events he was describing, not just read about them in classified reports. The Echo Lima crew survived because of exceptional navigation and coordination under extreme duress. Today we're finally able to acknowledge that service publicly. He gestured toward Margaret, who stood with automatic military bearing despite her civilian clothing. Master Sergeant Margaret Rowland, United States Air Force, served with distinction during Operation Frostline. Her technical expertise and personal courage saved 4 lives and preserved intelligence assets that remained critical to national security for over a decade. The applause began hesitantly, then built as people understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, the public acknowledgement of service that had been classified for longer than some of the younger personnel had been alive. But the moment that transformed the ceremony from routine military recognition to something more personal occurred when 2 older men entered the room. They were obviously retired military, though their bearing remained unmistakably professional. One walked with a slight limp, the other moved carefully as if favoring old injuries. "Echo Lima crew," one of them announced simply. "We've been waiting 15 years to say thank you." The emotion in the room shifted dramatically. This wasn't just about medals or official recognition anymore. This was about people who had survived something extraordinary, about debts that had remained unpaid because secrecy had prevented their acknowledgement. Margaret felt tears forming, but they were different from the controlled emotion she'd maintained during the hearing. These were tears of relief, of connection, of finally being able to stop carrying a burden alone. The senior crew member approached the podium. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Margaret directly, "without your coordinates, without your navigation during that storm, we wouldn't be here today. Our families wouldn't exist. Our children wouldn't have been born." He paused, visibly struggling with emotion. "We've thought about you every day for 15 years, wondering if you knew how important you were, wondering if anyone had ever told you." Margaret stood, her hand automatically moving to the challenge coin in her pocket. But this time, instead of touching it for comfort, she removed it and held it openly. Under the conference room lights, its insignia was clearly visible. The same Ghost Range designation that had started this entire revelation. "I've known," she said quietly. "I've always known." The ceremony concluded with General Waverly presenting Margaret with official documentation, declassified excerpts from Operation Frostline that restored her name to the historical record. But the real conclusion came when the Echo Lima survivors approached her personally, each carrying challenge coins that matched the one she'd carried alone for so many years. For the first time since leaving active duty, Margaret Rowland was no longer invisible. She was exactly who she had always been, a decorated veteran whose service had saved lives and whose sacrifice had finally been acknowledged by the people who mattered most. The maintenance worker with grease-stained hands was gone. In her place stood Master Sergeant Margaret Rowland, ready to decide what came next. The base's main conference room had been hastily transformed into something resembling a formal ceremony space, with chairs arranged in precise military rows and an American flag positioned prominently behind a simple wooden podium. The afternoon light streaming through tall windows cast geometric patterns across the polished floor, creating an atmosphere that felt both official and unexpectedly intimate. Margaret Rowland sat in the front row, still wearing her maintenance jacket with its newly restored medals, but everything about her posture had changed. The weight of the decorations seemed to have unlocked something that had been carefully buried for years, a bearing that spoke of training, discipline, and experiences that most people in the room couldn't begin to imagine. General Waverly had spent the better part of an hour making phone calls from the base commander's office, speaking with personnel whose names and titles suggested connections to operations that remained classified at levels most of the assembled crowd couldn't access. But the fragments that had been overheard, references to Echo Lima survivors, mentions of Frostline personnel, and repeated use of phrases like operational security and declassification authorization, had created enough intrigue to fill the conference room with curious observers. Word of the afternoon's extraordinary events had spread through Ellington Air Base with the peculiar efficiency of military gossip, drawing personnel who had no direct connection to the original hearing, but who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Mechanics from the flight line stood alongside administrative clerks, while off-duty air crew members found excuses to attend what had been described as a special recognition ceremony. Colonel Pierce sat near the back of the room, his earlier authority visibly diminished as he struggled to comprehend how completely his understanding of the case had been overturned. The documentation he'd relied upon, the digital records that had seemed so conclusive, were now revealed as deliberately incomplete fragments of a story that had been classified for reasons he was only beginning to understand. Elliot Crane occupied a seat near the evidence table where the faded patch still lay, displayed on its white cloth. Though its significance had been transformed entirely, what had begun as a piece of questionable evidence in a fraud case had become the key that unlocked 15 years of buried history, revealing not deception, but sacrifice that had never been properly acknowledged. When General Waverly took the podium, the room fell silent with the kind of instant attention that only occurred when someone with genuine authority prepared to speak. His uniform was immaculate despite the long travel day, and his bearing carried the weight of decisions that had affected thousands of lives over the course of a distinguished career. 15 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room, a weather reconnaissance mission encountered conditions that exceeded every operational parameter we had established. Arctic storm systems with wind speeds that should have made flight impossible, temperatures that challenged the limits of both equipment and human endurance, and intelligence requirements that demanded mission completion despite circumstances that any reasonable assessment would have declared unsurvivable. He paused, allowing the information to settle before continuing, and Margaret found herself transported back to memories she had spent years trying to contain, the bone-deep cold that penetrated even the most sophisticated protective gear, the constant vibration of aircraft engines straining against wind conditions that threatened to tear the plane apart, the peculiar quality of light that filtered through ice-covered windows during storms that seemed to belong to another planet entirely. The Echo Lima crew survived those conditions, Waverly continued, because of exceptional navigation and coordination under extreme duress. Their aircraft remained operational through weather that destroyed other planes. Their intelligence mission was completed despite equipment failures that should have been catastrophic, and 4 human beings returned home alive from an environment that had already claimed multiple aircraft and crews. His voice carried the weight of someone who had personally lived through the events he was describing, not just read about them in classified reports years later. Today, we're finally able to acknowledge publicly the service that made that survival possible. He gestured toward Margaret, who stood with automatic military bearing despite her civilian maintenance clothing. The movement felt natural now, no longer the careful concealment of instincts that might reveal too much about her background, but the proper response of someone whose training had never really been forgotten. Master Sergeant Margaret Rowland, United States Air Force, served with distinction during Operation Frostline. Her technical expertise in advanced navigation systems, her calm decision-making under extreme pressure, and her personal courage in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, saved 4 lives, and preserved intelligence assets that remained critical to national security for over a decade. The applause began hesitantly, scattered clapping from people who weren't entirely sure what they were witnessing, then built as the assembled crowd understood. They were present for something unprecedented, the public acknowledgement of service that had been classified for longer than some of the younger personnel had been alive. But the moment that transformed the ceremony from routine military recognition into something profoundly personal occurred when the conference room doors opened and 2 older men entered with the careful movements of people who had survived experiences that left permanent marks on both body and spirit. And they were obviously retired military, though their bearing remained unmistakably professional, despite civilian clothes that couldn't entirely conceal the posture and alertness that came from years of service in high-stress environments. One walked with a slight limp that suggested old injuries, while the other moved carefully, favoring his left side in a way that spoke of damage that had healed but never entirely disappeared. "Echo Lima crew," one of them announced simply, his voice carrying across the silent room. "We've been waiting 15 years to say thank you." The emotional atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically, the formal military ceremony suddenly becoming something much more intimate and powerful. This wasn't just about medals or official recognition anymore, wasn't just about bureaucratic corrections to service records or administrative vindication of past decisions. This was about people who had survived something extraordinary together, about debts of gratitude that had remained unpaid for years because secrecy requirements had prevented their acknowledgement. Margaret felt tears forming behind her eyes, but they were different from the controlled emotion she'd maintained throughout the earlier hearing. These weren't tears of relief at finally being believed, or satisfaction at having her honesty vindicated. These were tears of connection, of finally being able to stop carrying a burden that had been meant to be shared, of understanding that her sacrifice had been remembered and valued by the people whose lives had been at stake. The senior crew member approached the podium with obvious emotion, his weathered face showing the kind of lines that came from years of squinting into harsh conditions and making decisions under pressure that most people never had to face. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 15 years of unexpressed gratitude. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Margaret directly while the rest of the room listened in absolute silence. "Without your coordinates during that storm, without your navigation when our instruments failed, without your voice on the radio keeping us oriented when we couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction, we wouldn't be here today. Our families wouldn't exist. Our children wouldn't have been born. Our grandchildren wouldn't be running around asking us to tell stories about the old days." He paused, visibly struggling with emotion that had been building for over a decade. "We've thought about you every day for 15 years. wondering where you were, wondering if you knew how important you were, wondering if anyone had ever told you that what you did in that storm was the difference between life and death for people who had families counting on them to come home. Margaret stood silent for a moment, her hand automatically moving to the challenge coin in her pocket, the same coin she had carried through 15 years of anonymity, touching it unconsciously whenever she needed to remember that her life had once had meaning beyond routine maintenance work and carefully controlled invisibility. But this time, instead of touching the coin for comfort or reassurance, she removed it from her pocket and held it openly where everyone in the room could see it, under the conference room's bright lights. Its insignia was clearly visible, the same Ghost Range designation that had started this entire revelation, the same operational symbol that had appeared on the faded patch Elliot had discovered. "I've known," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "I've carried this with me every day for 15 years. I've always known that what we did mattered, that the mission was completed, that everyone came home. That knowledge has been enough." The ceremony concluded with General Waverly presenting Margaret with official documentation, declassified excerpts from Operation Frostline that restored her name to the historical record and provided written acknowledgement of service that had previously existed only in classified files accessible to a handful of personnel with specialized clearances. But the real conclusion came when the Echo Lima survivors approached her personally, each carrying challenge coins that matched the one she had held alone for so many years. The coins were worn smooth from handling, carried as talismans by men who had never forgotten the voice that had guided them through impossible weather back to safety. "We've got something else," the second crew member said, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a small wooden box. "We had this made years ago, hoping someday we'd be able to give it to you." Inside the box was a navigational compass, its brass surface engraved with coordinates that Margaret recognized immediately, the exact position where Echo Lima had been when the storm reached its worst intensity, when instrument failure had left them flying blind in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. "Those are the coordinates you gave us," the crew member explained, "the ones that kept us oriented when we couldn't see anything, couldn't trust our instruments, couldn't rely on anything except your voice and your calculations." Margaret accepted the compass with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that she was receiving not just a gift, but a physical representation of the connection she had maintained with these men across 15 years of enforced silence. The metal was warm against her palms, and the weight of it felt substantial, real, permanent. For the first time since leaving active duty, Margaret Rowland was no longer invisible. She was no longer the anonymous maintenance worker with grease-stained hands and carefully concealed competence. She was exactly who she had always been, Master Sergeant Margaret Rowland, a decorated veteran whose service had saved lives, whose sacrifice had been remembered and honored by the people who mattered most. As the ceremony dispersed and people began to leave the conference room, Margaret found herself surrounded by personnel who wanted to shake her hand, to express their respect, to acknowledge service that they were only now learning had taken place on their own base for years without recognition. The maintenance worker with thick glasses and deliberately modest bearing was gone, replaced by someone who no longer had to hide her competence or conceal the depth of her experience. In her place stood Master Sergeant Margaret Rowland, decorated veteran, expert navigator, and someone who was finally ready to decide what came next in a life that no longer had to be lived in the shadows. The morning light streaming through General Waverly's office windows carried a golden quality that seemed to transform even the most utilitarian military furniture into something warmer, more welcoming. Margaret Rowland sat across from the general at a simple conference table, but the atmosphere was entirely different from their previous meetings, less formal, more personal, characterized by the kind of mutual respect that developed between people who had shared similar experiences under extreme conditions. Waverly had requested the private meeting to discuss what he described as opportunities for continued service, but Margaret understood that what they were really discussing was the possibility of reclaiming not just her identity, but her sense of purpose, the feeling that her work contributed to something larger than individual survival or personal advancement. "The military has changed significantly since you left active duty," Waverly began, spreading several documents across the table between them. "Technology has advanced, training protocols have been updated, and the nature of the threats we face has evolved in ways that require new approaches to old problems. He paused, studying her expression carefully before continuing. But the fundamentals of service, of courage under pressure, of making critical decisions, when failure means that people don't come home to their families, those elements remain constant, and we need people who understand what that really means, not just in theory, but from personal experience. The documents he had arranged on the table included official proposals for various positions, instructor roles at advanced training facilities, consulting positions with manufacturers developing new navigation systems, liaison assignments that would involve working with international military partners on joint operations. Each opportunity represented not just employment, but a chance to contribute expertise that had been developed under the most demanding circumstances possible. Margaret examined the proposals carefully, noting the scope of responsibility each position would entail, the travel requirements, the security clearances that would need to be restored after 15 years of deliberately limiting her professional horizons. The range of possibilities felt both exciting and overwhelming. "There's something else," Waverly said, removing an additional folder from his briefcase. "Something I wanted to discuss personally before presenting it as an official option." He opened the folder to reveal architectural plans for what appeared to be a new training facility, complete with advanced simulation equipment, classroom spaces designed for small group instruction, and residential facilities that could accommodate students from multiple military branches and allied nations. "The Advanced Navigation Training Center," he explained, "a joint service facility that would provide specialized instruction in extreme weather navigation, emergency coordination procedures, and survival techniques for conditions that exceed normal operational parameters." Margaret studied the plans with growing interest, recognizing equipment specifications that represented significant advances over the technology she had used during Operation Frostline, but also noting that the fundamental challenges, human decision-making under pressure, maintaining coordination when communication systems failed, navigating by instruments and intuition when electronic systems became unreliable, remained essentially unchanged. "You're offering me the chance to run this facility?" she asked. "I'm offering you the chance to design the training program that would make this facility effective," Waverly replied, "to determine what skills are truly essential, what scenarios need to be practiced, what kind of preparation actually makes the difference between success and failure when everything that can go wrong does go wrong simultaneously." The offer represented more than just career advancement or professional recognition. It was an opportunity to ensure that future generations of aircrew would be better prepared for the kinds of extreme conditions she had survived, that the lessons learned during Operation Frostline would be transmitted to people who might someday face similar challenges. "The students would come from all branches of service?" Margaret asked, beginning to envision the scope of such a program. "All branches, all allied nations, Navy pilots who might need to navigate through hurricane conditions, Army aviation crews operating in mountain weather that changes by the minute, Air Force personnel conducting reconnaissance missions in Arctic environments, international partners who need to coordinate with American forces during joint operations." Waverly leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "Margaret, you survived conditions that killed other crews. You maintained navigation accuracy when instruments failed, kept communication lines open when radio systems were compromised, and made decisions under pressure that saved lives. That knowledge is irreplaceable, and it's knowledge that could prevent future tragedies if it's properly transmitted to the people who need it." The weight of the opportunity settled over her gradually. This wasn't just about personal redemption or professional advancement. It was about taking responsibility for preparing others to survive challenges that might prove fatal if they were inadequately trained. "I'd want complete authority over curriculum development," she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who was beginning to negotiate seriously. "Complete authority," Waverly confirmed, "and I'd want to select my own instructional staff, people with actual experience in extreme conditions, not just academic expertise." Agreed. The training would need to be realistic, pushing students to their limits in controlled conditions, so they understand what they're capable of when there are no safety nets. Waverly smiled with obvious satisfaction. "That's exactly what we need. Training that prepares people for reality, not just for textbook scenarios." Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out across the base where young aircrew members were conducting routine training exercises, practicing maneuvers that would become automatic responses during actual missions. She could see the navigation training building, where students struggled with calculations that would determine flight paths under adverse conditions, supervised by instructors who were competent but had never actually navigated through weather systems capable of destroying aircraft. "Those kids out there," she said, gesturing toward the training area. "They're going to face conditions that will test every aspect of their preparation. Some of them will encounter situations where the difference between life and death comes down to decisions made in seconds, based on training they received months or years earlier." She turned back to face Waverly, her decision evident in her posture and expression. They deserve to learn from someone who's been where they're going, someone who knows what it's really like when all the safety systems fail, and survival depends on knowledge, instinct, and the ability to function effectively when everything that can go wrong has gone wrong. "Is that a yes?" Waverly asked. "That's a yes," Margaret confirmed. "I'll design your training program, and I'll make sure that every student who graduates from it is prepared for the worst conditions they might ever encounter." The handshake that sealed the agreement felt like more than just an employment contract. It felt like a restoration of purpose that had been missing from Margaret's life since she left active duty. For 15 years, she had used her skills to maintain aircraft and support other people's missions. Now she would have the opportunity to prepare future aircrew members to survive the kinds of challenges that had defined her own service. As Waverly gathered the documents and prepared to leave, he paused at the door with one final comment. "Margaret, what you're taking on, it's not just instruction, it's leadership. You'll be responsible for shaping how an entire generation of military aviators approaches extreme conditions." "That's a significant responsibility," Margaret nodded, understanding the weight of what she was accepting. "General, I've spent 15 years wondering if what I learned during Frostline would ever benefit anyone other than myself. Now I have the chance to make sure that knowledge serves its proper purpose, keeping people alive and bringing them home safely." After Waverly left, Margaret remained in the office for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the changes taking place in her life. Yesterday, she had been a maintenance worker facing fraudulent charges. Today, she was a decorated veteran preparing to design training programs that would affect military aviation for years to come. The challenge coin in her pocket felt different now, not a private reminder of past service, but a symbol of ongoing responsibility. The navigational compass given to her by the Echo Lima survivors sat on the table where she could see it, its engraved coordinates serving as a permanent reminder that precision and courage under pressure could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. Master Sergeant Margaret Rowland was no longer invisible, no longer hidden behind the protective anonymity that had been necessary for operational security. She was exactly who she had always been, a navigator who brought people home safely, and now, someone who would teach others to do the same. The quiet work would continue, but it would no longer be conducted in isolation. Instead, it would be shared, multiplied, transmitted to students who would carry that knowledge into conditions that couldn't be predicted, but could be survived with proper preparation and training. Her story had become part of the permanent record, but more importantly, her expertise would become part of the institutional knowledge that would protect future generations of aircrew members facing their own impossible conditions. The restoration was complete, but the real work was just beginning.